Good morning, everyone. My name is Asma Mahdi, and I'm a Senior Policy Director at Better World Group. And today we are so honored to bring together a panel of leaders who are transforming the fight for climate justice, whether that means taking on oil interests, encouraging youth to take climate action in their daily lives, or providing a platform so youth can participate in local activism. They've made it clear that the future of the environmental movement is inclusive, it's impatient with inaction, and it's also digitally savvy. And I want to open up our digital space today by recognizing that Better World Group as an environmental policy and consulting firm and working on issues that intersect with public lands, climate change, transportation, racial and environmental justice. We want to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, who are the traditional land caretakers of the Los Angeles region. So today's conversation is focused on the climate leaders of today and tomorrow, and we have three of them here with us today. We'll moderate the conversation over the next hour. In the last 20 minutes of the conversation, our panelists will answer audience questions. So at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A chat function. You can click on that. You can type in your questions directly into there. That'll allow myself and the panelists to be able to see the questions. And in those last 20 minutes, we'll try our best to get to all the questions that you may have for Isaiah, Nayeli, and Kevin today. So what I want to do now is introduce our panel. And again, we're excited to have you all in conversation with us. So these are some of the next generation of environmental activists and leaders who have infused this movement with energy and the need to fight for a better future. So I first want to introduce Nayeli Cobo. So Nayeli's activism in her community began when she was 9 years old, and she took on a toxic oil drilling site in her community. Nayeli and her neighbors took action by creating a grassroots campaign called People Not Pozos, People Not Wells. And Nayeli played a lead role in fighting for a temporary closure of the Alanco drilling site in 2013 and continues to push for the permanent closure of the facility. Currently, Nayeli is also the co-founder of South LA's Youth Leadership Coalition. She is a member of Stand LA, the Stand Together Against Neighborhood Drilling in Los Angeles, which is currently working to end neighborhood oil drilling to protect the health and safety of Angelenos like herself on the front lines of urban oil drilling. And currently Nayeli is working towards her undergraduate degree at Whittier College and plans to pursue a career as a civil rights attorney. So welcome, Nayeli. Also joining us, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah. Also joining us today is Isaiah Hernandez, who is an environmental educator and creator of Queer Brown Vegan, an educational outlet and safe space for other like-minded individuals to learn terminology in the environmental movement. Isaiah is a Los Angeles native, grew up in a community that faced environmental injustices, which shaped his interest to learn about environmental issues. Isaiah recently earned his bachelor's in environmental science at the University of California, Berkeley, and works as a public speaker, sustainability consultant, and business coach. Welcome, Isaiah.
Thank you so much again for having me.
Absolutely. And finally, we have Kevin Patel, who has fought as an intersectional climate justice activist from Los Angeles for the past 10 years. In 2019, Kevin founded One Up Action, an organization that supports and empowers marginalized youth by providing them with the resources they need to be change makers. Kevin has created the first of its kind Youth Climate Commission in LA County to amplify youth voices on the climate crisis. Kevin is a UN Together band ambassador for goals 7, 13, and 14. You might need to tell us what that means. And he is a National Geographic Young Explorer. He also serves on the Youthtopia World, the Circle of Youth Council, the Intersectional Environmental Council, and the Climate Power Creative Advisory Board. Kevin is currently pursuing his undergraduate degree in political science at Loyola Marymount University. So it's wonderful to have you here as well.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for being with us here today. It's just truly an honor to get to moderate this panel. So I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have. Nayeli, I want to turn to you first. And there could not be anything more timely happening right now related to what you've been fighting for since you were 9. So right now, the LA County Board of Supervisors are in the midst of voting to phase out oil drilling in unincorporated LA County and the Inglewood oil fields. So urban oil drilling in LA has and continues to be a major environmental injustice in vulnerable communities across the region. And so for decades, this issue has really flown under the radar of regulatory agencies and in the media. So in your bio, we talked about how you and your neighbors helped shine a spotlight on this discriminatory industry and its practices with your youth activism in South LA against the Alanco drilling site. So I have 2 questions for you. The first is, could you tell us more about, or speak to the critical role young community leaders like yourself played in ultimately getting people in power to act to address oil drilling activity in your community? And second, I would love to hear your reflections on what it feels like to have pushed the conversation this far and potentially be close to what, like, fingers crossed, a major victory for you and EJ communities across the county.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I remember growing up with an oil well as your neighbor. It's not like having that annoying neighbor that wakes up at 5 in the morning to mow his lawn, or the one that parties until 3 a.m. Like, this neighbor was poisoning us. It was poisoning not only me, but my family, most of my community. And the fact that a lot of us, even youth, still decided to stand up and share our stories. We still decided to stand up and advocate for ourselves, because at the end of the day, nobody knows our story better than us. Nobody knows what we've been through more than us. And a lot of times when we were doing this, you're only 9, you don't know what you're talking about, or leave this to the grown-ups, or without oil, you wouldn't turn on your stove to cook for your family, sweetie. And it's like, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people literally being poisoned within their own homes. We're talking about people not being open to open their windows because they're afraid of the toxic emissions they're going to inhale. We're talking about people who have so many health issues now and can have more issues and more health issues in the future, and that's scary. Another thing with this work, it's also reminding ourselves that we're capable. A lot of times we fight these big corporations or industries or people in power, and we tend to feel overshadowed or overwhelmed, or I'm only one person. I barely speak English. I don't think I can fight, but there's power in numbers. There's power in our stories, and these elected officials work for us. They do. We vote them into those seats. We can vote them out if they're not doing their job. And our job is to remind them to represent us. It's to remind them to be our voice. And if we get this passed, it would be a major victory protecting so many Angelinos. It would 580,000 Angelinos live within a quarter of a mile or less to an active oil and gas well. That's 500,000 people. That's crazy. And we're not talking about this issue. We're not pushing as much as we should. So when we get this passed, oh my goodness, I'm gonna start jumping on my legs. I don't know what I'm gonna do.
Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, it's taken a movement, and you've been leading that charge. And I love what you said about storytelling, because it reminds me of when we think about Indigenous cultures, and the power of storytelling as a way to keep culture alive and for those cultures to thrive. And that's also very inherent for a lot of communities of color as well, when we think about our elders and how they share their stories and pass down history from generation to generation. So kind of in that vein, I want to pull you into the conversation, because when we think about storytelling, we're pivoting in storytelling to really this digital space. So much of activism and community organizing, especially over the last year with the pandemic, has pivoted into social media platforms like Instagram. Twitter has been there, but like the emergence of TikTok, I don't know what happened to Snapchat, but they're revolutionizing how millennials and Gen Zers communicate, how we stay in touch, and how we're really organizing around social movements. So as someone who's a professional content creator, Can you share more on how social media has assisted you in your advocacy to educate folks on sustainability and environmental justice?
Yeah, definitely. So I would like to say that, I think digital media spaces, with the popularization with Instagram, TikTok, all these media apps, it has created, in a sense, an avenue of accessible resources for people. Back when I was like a teenager in middle school and high school, um, there wasn't such a thing of like, go Google it yourself. It was more like, well, what keywords do I Google to learn about injustice? Like, what is environmental racism when my school doesn't even talk about it? We talk about global warming. And so I've seen how language has evolved over social media, and it has rapidly kind of created these like outlets for a lot of people not to feel self-shamed about learning this, and more like a vulnerable spot of where educational systems are failing students. And so whether whoever we are, whatever place we are all indoctrinated by a lot of education systems here in the United States. And so the component about injustice, like people, culture, land, resources, those interconnections are necessarily not always being made. And so I think now a lot of people are reclaiming their own experiences as educators, advocates, activists, like to be on these spaces. But I think it's also about validating how we can both coexist Western science and Indigenous science intertwined and include our own lived experiences with environmentalism to prove our point. Because I think that's the point of what brings people on social media, is creating these online relationships, but also meeting people offline. Because like Naomi was saying, like it's about offline relationships that will help save your community, meaning that like at the end of the day, when there is a crisis, when is there injustice, I tend to think about cultural, religious, spiritual displacement. And so these people in our communities are part of these web digital communities that provide this accessibility. Because as mentioned in this movement, language accessibility is a huge issue in a lot of movements, and specifically with environmental justice. In the areas that we are working with, especially where I grew up, it's predominantly people who speak Spanish. And so presenting those resources in alternative views that doesn't, that kind of gives them this more introductory form and kind of creates this curiosity for them to start asking questions.
Thank you. I wrote this down, this line that, or this quote that you said, offline relationships that will save our communities. So I have to ask each of you this question. And this is sort of like in the vein of, social media activism. So last week, I think you all are aware that the broadcasting network CBS announced this new competition show called The Activist. So this is where activists that are working on important social change movements compete with one another for a prize to fund their work. And the show received a lot of heat on social media, like on Twitter, on Instagram, for being really antithetical to movement building. And folks called out how disturbing it was to see, popular, well-paid celebrities judge activists who have very lived experiences in their realms of activism. So there's so many levels to this story, but I'd love to actually hear from each of you, but maybe Kevin, bring you in first about how do you see pop culture harming or diluting or appropriating activists and activism right now, specifically for you all and those who are fighting on climate and environmental justice?
Yeah, of course. And thank you for the question. I just want to say, how noble, even how noble their actions might have been or intentions have been. We can't accept the fact that pitting activists against each other really upholds the systems of oppression, but upholds oppression Olympics at this point. I myself, and I'm sure Isaiah and Nayeli both can agree. We find it very, disturbing how a corporation such as CBS or even an organization such as Global Citizens can go and proceed with this project when so many of the community members, the people who have been fighting for so long on different injustices, are so against it. I myself was invited to participate, and I thought it was a joke at first, but we're seeing it's not a joke. So I definitely want to say it's like, this is, furthermore, it's like, it doesn't get us justice. It just pits us against each other, and it brings about the standard that, activists are in competition with one another. Like, issues are singular to that activist, and it's not interconnected, that we're not connecting the dots, and making sure that it's not only intersectional but intergenerational. And so that for me was the straw. And really, me and along with a lot of other activists are, putting a letter together to kind of send a message to these producers and the organizations and corporations that are involved in the production of this show, The Activists, to really put a stop to it and really show that we really must understand that you can't just put activists against each other. We have to really truly understand that every issue is interconnected, and that if we pursue with this, we'll never get justice. But I'll let Isaiah or Nayeli add on to what I just said.
Yeah, and if I can, maybe Nayeli, if I could bring you in too to respond, because what Kevin really highlighted and I appreciated is the intersectionality of climate and environmental justice and any justice movement, right? Like, we're all, we can't, in order to uplift one another, we have to understand each other's issues and work alongside each other. So this inherent, the way that they're creating this show, siloing these issues almost. I'm curious, Nayeli, to hear your thoughts on just how important intersectionality is to, EJ and climate justice.
Yeah, of course. Also, just because I have a few comments on the activist show, I don't get the purpose of it. Like, a true, genuine activist fights to create change, not to get fame or something. And with the whole putting activists against each other, that's not how any of us win in the long run. We win by supporting one another, by showing up for each other's fights. And like Kevin was saying, this is all connected. We're all an intersectional movement. If I show up for something against fast fashion, I'm also showing up for against ocean pollution and against for animal rights and so many other things. Like, it's a lot of times in this movement, people are just so stuck within their own fight, and they're so focused on only their wins. But we have to remember to be selfless, to fight for not only our communities, but so many other communities, because we are all brothers and sisters at the end of the day. And if we show up for each other, that's how we're going to create more change. And with all of us being united with our fists in the air, marching together, we're going to be unstoppable. And if we're already unstoppable now, here and there, with showing up, imagine the mountains we can move if we all show up and we all just put our differences aside and just care for our earth and show up for each other and love each other. But going back, sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you got to that point about like the intersectionality and the importance of that in both the EJ and climate justice movement. And, I heard from you just like how important it is for, no matter where you are and what issues that we're working on, that we're showing up for one another across platforms.
Yeah.
Isaiah, I'd love to invite you to comment as well.
Yeah, I completely agree what you were saying. And I think it's similar to what we see parallels in industries. And we talked about this in our pre-meeting, is that nonprofit industrial complex compete for grants, meaning that they're always constantly trying to prove to their funders that they're doing great work. And so it becomes a competition between NGOs to do grant writing. And specifically when I did grant writing in college, I will say it is extremely difficult to do. Like, I had to do it with a group of people to figure this out. But I think that it's also important that when this show is released, that we be critical on the idea and the producers that produced it, not specifically the people. Yes, the people should not be held in a pedestal too, I agree with that. But to ask ourselves too, how do we hold ourselves accountable to things that we may have done, because there are issues and errors that I've done within this movement where I've been called in by elders to address some of the issues that I've done. And so I think like it's super important that like building these spaces is super essential, and truly calling out these producers because this is what the market demands for. And also just remembering the fact of how activism influencers like are kind of intertwined these days now with social media, and you don't ever want it to become to a point where you see social media influencers calling themselves revolutionaries, when revolutionaries are so different than activists. And the way that a lot of revolutionaries have died is because of fighting against injustice, and just honoring that too is super important.
Thank you, Isaiah. You sparked this idea in my head that it almost feels like traditional media and social media are competing against each other. And so this is a way, and so you see this like compounding effect within these realms, and how it produces this platform, for these kinds of shows to happen. Kevin, I want to pivot to you now, and turn our conversation to Governor Newsom, who was not recalled last night. And he recently issued an executive order calling for 100% zero emission cars by 2035 and trucks by 2045, in a groundbreaking announcement to meet California's climate goals. So, as someone who's young, whose health has been impacted as a result of bad air quality, how do you view the state's approach to curbing mobile source emissions? And what are some of the gaps, do you think, in the current course of action?
Yeah, of course. I think, Governor Newsom's plan is a step towards the right direction, but I also think that he's not addressing the root causes of air pollution and smog pollution in certain communities, such as like there's pollution that's caused by the factories, as well as the urban oil drilling that is happening near communities of Wilmington and Long Beach. So definitely a lot of that, I would say, is like unaddressed, and we really need to start tackling the urban drilling and the oil drilling and the oil production sector of things, but also the factories that are within just different communities of, I would say, marginalized communities throughout the state of California. So addressing both the factories and the urban oil drilling, and then it's a good step towards just focusing on mobile, curbing mobile emissions. But I think it's not the full scope of like what is really causing air and smog pollution. And there's definitely a lot more sources where emissions are being caused from, but definitely the two things that come to mind right now are oil production, as well as the factories that are spread out throughout the state of California.
Yeah, right. We just come back to that, conversation about intersectionality and how important it is to think about how these different industries are all kind of connected, and the issues are all kind of connected. Nayeli, I want to turn to you and talk with you about a little more about like your activism. Something that in the last year we've seen a reemergence and a resurgence on racial justice and the fight for racial justice. How does that inform your activism? And I'm curious about what other intersectional issues are important to the climate movement as well.
A big one is environmental racism, and people don't even know that exists. And they're like, environmental racism? Like, no, that's not a thing. That's just people being sensitive or people being extra, and that's not the case. Like, these corporations do studies to see what communities are more at risk, what communities are less educated, what communities know less about our rights, essentially. They call us sacrifice zones, and they put these monsters near us. I grew up 30 feet from an active oil and gas well called Alanco, and they would operate on land leased to them by the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. So as a community, we were fighting three monsters. It was the oil industry, the archdiocese without attacking the faith, and the broken regulatory system as people of color constantly have to fight against. And with them simply saying, these people can be poisoned and these people can, or with certain studies when trying to expand or pass or build new oil wells previously, when they would just do rubber stamping, they would say no limit to based on how many wells were open in Wilmington or South Central. But if someone was opening in a more wealthy, affluent community, for example, Beverly Hills, they made sure they only operated from 9 to 5 when people are typically not home, that special filters were put up, that they were silent, that they had special this, special that, but none of that was put in place with us. And that's environmental racism. That's them choosing that somehow someone is better than the other and that they deserve the right to breathe clean air. And that's why I fight, because clean air is a basic human right. We shouldn't have to fight for it. We shouldn't have to fight for it in the United States when we claim to be such a progressive nation, when we're still poisoning our own people. It's really frustrating. And knowing that, again, when you try to talk about this, you try to raise education and awareness on this issue, sometimes we're just shut down saying like, no, environmental racism doesn't exist, but it's real and it's out there.
And thank you for providing that like description and definition around environmental racism and context. I think that that's so much of the terminology and what I personally have found very helpful in, you know, social media is learning the like different ways of terminology and words. Isaiah, well, before I move to Isaiah, I just want to remind folks that if you have any questions and answers, there is a Q&A button on your screen. You can go ahead and type in your question into that box. The hosts, the panelists and myself will be able to see it. And in about 10 minutes or so, we'll shift over to audience Q&A and would love to answer some of the questions that you all might have for our panelists. Isaiah, I want to go back in time and, you know, if you were to go back in time actually, and give yourself some words of encouragement when you were just beginning your climate justice journey, what advice would you tell yourself?
I would say to continue asking questions and interrogating teachers. I think what happened to me at a younger age is I was silenced. And so since I was already silenced and my parents were working to survive, how do you have those conversations and what are the right ways to kind of address this? And this is where it's like intergenerational knowledge is super important, because had there actually been more outreach with environmental justice organizations working with schools, like public schools in the LA area where I grew up in, there would have been more longer impact of change for people creating those interconnected relationships, rather than like people being uncomfortable when environmental racism is talked about, right? Like saying like the environment can't be racist, that's not true. And it's like, that is true in a sense, but the people who design the policies for environment are racist and uphold racist stances. So I think for the words of encouragement I would tell myself is to really stick true with my community and to constantly find out what is the best way for you to navigate, because I believe that in a lot of movement spaces today, when I was younger too, is that there's a lot of trauma, and there's this constant oppression Olympics or re-traumatization of like, if you're not in the front lines being traumatized like me, then you're not doing enough. And this creates this everlasting change of like, why are we constantly pitting ourselves against each other, which is what oppressors want from us. And this ends up leading into like divestment of spaces. So I'd say that like knowing true to yourself and holding true accountable to your community is what matters the most, because at the end of the day, like, who do you serve to and for whom is something that I really have learned and like asked myself growing up when I had mentors in college, and I was like, wow, this would have changed my life in high school, but it didn't. So I think there's no such regrets, because everything I did was because of some reason. And the only thing that can be done now is to create that change within myself and provide more resources to others.
I appreciate that. Just like, it's part of the evolution and the learning journey of how you get to where you are. I mean, each of us come from different varied experiences and backgrounds, and something that, through this conversation that we've had so far, I've just been thinking about cultural relevancy too in the work that we're doing. And that you all are doing. So Kevin, I want to ask you the same question, and Nayeli, after that, if you could respond too about, what do you, if you were to go back in time, what words of encouragement, would you give yourself, or if you would change anything, or the advice that you might have to a younger version of you?
Yeah, before I go to that and answer that question, I just want to kind of backtrack a little bit and add to what Isaiah and Nayeli were talking about of like environmental racism. Environmental racism, really describes the environmental injustice that occurs with a racialized context, both in practice and policy, like Isaiah and Nayeli were saying. And so when we're like looking at when it comes to the exposure to poor air quality or water quality and soil quality, we're seeing that a lot of that happens within marginalized and disproportionately happens within BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous people of color. So like with Nayeli bring up a word that, kind of I also have started to use, given that I live in a sacrifice zone, right? A sacrifice zone really kind of explains how we as marginalized communities are faced with so many injustices within not only our communities but within neighboring communities of that of our initial community, but it really just kind of explains how corporations as well as governments really have this working team together, and they are creating policies, and they know that our communities they're really under resourced. While we have a lot of resources within our own backyards, they're coming into our backyards and extracting those resources, but none of those resources come back into our communities. So when we're trying to fight these industries and when we're trying to fight these corporations, we really don't have the funding, we don't really have the support, nor do we know the laws or the bypasses to kind of fight these industries, these corporations that are coming right in our backyards to extract, to take out all the resources from our communities. And so there's no really investment in that community, so that we're left with so much injustice, so much, so many inequalities, so many problems and issues to deal with. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up, given that, that's something that we really need to solve and really invest within our communities to not only teach them about what their rights are, but that they have a voice to stand up. And going to your question, what I would tell myself when I first got started, I started at the age of like 11 or 12 at a very young age. And, I come from a community called South Central Los Angeles. I'm from South LA. And just like Nayeli and Isaiah as well, I believe Isaiah is from, I don't think so he's from South LA, but I think Nayeli is. But both me and Nayeli, both come from South LA, and we know that there's so many injustices. When I first, got started, I saw that there's food inequality, food deserts, and then next thing you know, my life changed in a matter of minutes by being affected by the air pollution and smog pollution. And so I just saw that there's not just one or two issues, there's multitude of issues that are happening within my community. And if we're not standing up, if we're not speaking out, then who will, right? And if we're not empowering our communities, who will? And so what I would tell myself would be just to keep pursuing, no matter what obstacles, what adversities that I face, just to keep fighting. And that should never stop you from doing what you want to do or what you love to do. So yeah, I would tell myself to just keep pushing and keep thriving and keep fighting for what you believe in.
Thanks, Kevin. Nayeli, do you want to share a little bit you were 9 when you started, but I'm curious, what advice would you give yourself maybe, and maybe even now, to just keep continuing to do the work?
I think something that's so important that we often forget is self-care. And like a lot of the times we think that resting or self-care is selfish, but it's not. And it took me so long to think of like to finally understand to like put oxygen masks on yourself before helping others. I was like, no, that doesn't make any sense. You think I'm gonna like put it on myself and not put it on other people, but if I'm not breathing, how am I gonna help other people breathe? And reminding to it's okay to take a break. It's okay to step away from your inbox for a day because you're overwhelmed. It's okay to say no to an event. It's you're not any less of an activist. If anything, you're being an even better activist because you're prioritizing yourself, you're prioritizing your mental health. That's so important because without us, we are literally nothing. And at the end of the day, we're all we got. So if we just, I don't know, I know a lot of times I still sometimes feel guilty about like, no, like I don't want to take a day off for this and that, but it's so important. I think also remaining positive. It's so easy to be distracted and overwhelmed with so many negative things that are going on day to day in this world, but each day there's a small victory in it somehow. Like today, a victory is even having the possibility for the city council to vote on a phase out. Like that's huge. Years ago, when I started, we would go to home meetings and just get doors slammed in our face. Like we've come such a long way, and worst case, it doesn't get passed. You know, they voted, and we've come a long way that it even made it on the agenda. Like being positive and just saying that I don't know, being positive and self-care I think are really important, and we tend to push them away sometimes in this realm of work.
Yeah, and thank you for uplifting that, because I think what, all of you are doing, maybe knowingly or unknowingly, is modeling for so many folks, and not that responsibility should be placed on you, but it gives people permission, right? Like they're following you, they're seeing how you're engaging in your own activism, and it gives them the permission and modeling that behavior of like, oh, I should take a step back and I should like also take care of myself. So appreciate you so much lifting that up, Nayeli. So I want to turn to audience Q&A, and I just want to remind folks that if you want to ask a question of any of our panelists, to go ahead and use that function, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can go ahead and type in your question into that box, and then we can read and answer your questions live on the screen. So we do have one question in here, and the question is, have you found it easier to connect with community-based organizations and environmental justice groups than with mainstream environmental groups? And my guess is maybe mainstream environmental groups thinking of like NGOs and larger NGOs. If so, why do you think that is? So this one could go to anyone if either of you have, or any of you have thoughts on that.
I'll get started. I've had my fair share of working with quite a lot of nonprofits, and from mainstream nonprofits to community-led organizations. And I think it's much more easier to work with community-led organizations and EJ organizations because they're really rooted in focusing on the community, and really fighting for justice. A lot of mainstream organizations are, I had my fair share of working, back then. I was the only Indian Asian American, especially dark-skinned Indian Asian American, to be in these spaces. And so being in these mainstream groups was really I was the outlier coming into a group that I just did not fit into. And so a lot of their priorities and a lot of their goals did not fit into what I was looking to achieve. And I stuck with my community-led organizations, or even pursued my own to make that space for people of color who just didn't have that space and still don't have that space within the environmental movement. I know it's getting better, but I think a lot of people need to recognize that we still have a lot of issues within our environmental movements, where a lot of Black, Indigenous, people of color still are excluded from the conversations of environmentalism and environmental racism and all these other topics. And so it's just, I've seen a change from 10 years ago, but which is really nice, and bringing in more diverse voices and more people into these key positions and key tables, right? But I think we can do a lot more. So I would say it's much more easier working with community-led organizations and EJ orgs because we got stuff done and we really help the community and whatnot. Yeah.
Nayeli or Isaiah, do you want to add to Kevin's comment?
I can go. I also think that working with community-based organizations, I think they're just a lot of the times easier to reach out to. So at least for me personally, I really struggle with reaching out to people or networking or like social media, like all of that kind of overwhelms me, if I'm being honest. So when it comes to like working with a smaller thing, I feel like I gravitate more towards that, and I feel like I'm more welcomed and less like, I don't know how to explain it. But I feel like they are more community oriented and focused on prioritizing frontline communities, like Clevin said, because at the end of the day, sometimes people come into our communities thinking we need saving, and that's not what we need. We don't need a savior. We don't need a fancy scientist with a Harvard degree with a white doctor coat coming into my community of South LA saying, I know how to help you guys. No, we know what we need as a community. We just need to be heard. We need to be uplifted, and we need to be supported and given the space to share what we know about our communities. Yeah.
I absolutely love the savior aspect, especially because it's a common rhetoric that happens in a lot of environmental research spaces, even when people do research, for example. But I would say, like, I think, like, looking at a whole environmental organizations, like animal rights and I believe conservation organizations receive the largest funding, and EJ organizations actually receive the least amount of funding. And something that I've kind of discovered is the fact of like who has the infrastructure and the platform to be more what you would call quote unquote structural or more of a public appearance out there. But in reality, like Nayeli was saying and Kevin was saying, like I personally found EJ orgs more connecting because it's people with my lived experiences, people who have experienced injustice, people who are like, you know, I don't really care about these social media spaces. I'm just here for my community. And I think that with the nonprofit industrial complex, it kind of like the conservation organizations or those that are like state apolitical, quote unquote, they get these celebrities to talk about these comforting issues that are, you know, not so much political for them. But in reality, we need these, like, not even need these celebrities, but these celebrities at least should donate their resources or their funds or wealth to these EJ organizations, not even say anything about it and let the people operate. Because I think it's just, it is ridiculous that we are in this movement where, you know, people are arguing about what is the most sustainable product, but yet how do we have a conversation about environmental racism about this? Because in reality, like, why are we still stuck on these conversations? And it just goes to show, like, at the end of the day, like communities and low income areas know, like, you know, these people aren't going to save us because they're over here fighting over which celebrity is going to be doing their panel. We're over here just trying to say, how can we feed people after a natural disaster? So I think it's just about understanding like how we can do that and how we can amplify it. And me as a content creator now, it's like, how do I leverage my own privilege and resources to my community that does not give it a savior type of like, let me enter back this community, but be like, just use me as a resource and to extract me. So then you are able to build your own infrastructure, because it is ridiculous to see that our organizations do not want to collaborate always with EJ orgs.
I couldn't agree more, Isaiah. I think that like your way of saying it, like use me for our own communities, like it's us letting each other step on each other's back, like the way that we've known what we've been through, we've lived those experiences, like nobody gets it better than us. And having that connection is something that nobody can take away from us. And even if people come into this and they're like, oh, this celebrity or this post at this march or this selfie at this march, like we're there not because of that. We don't care about that. Like you said, like we're there to survive. We're there to go home and hopefully be able to open our windows if the oil well doesn't smell too hard. Like these are our lives, and a lot of the times these corporations, orgs, monsters, I'm going to call them monsters, just look at us as statistics, as a number, as a little dot, and that's not it. We're people. We're people that work 14 to 16-hour days to provide for their families. We're people that are Spanish speaking, that are immigrants, that have bend their backs and do flips and everything for their family, and we're still viewed as less than. Like, ugh.
I just want to add,
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add that, I think who better to implement solutions than the community itself, right? We talk about how we work really, really hard, and that's all true, but who better from our experiences, because we know these injustices and these inequalities. So who better than our community to bring those solutions? And I just wanted to add that little part, because I know Isaiah and Nayeli both kind of touched on that, the aspect of like, who better to know what we're going through than our own community, but who better to bring the solutions than our own community, right? Because that's also something that I've seen, that a lot of the solutions that are dictated on behalf of our communities are not really coming from our community. And so solutions really need to be driven by our community members who know the injustices that are happening within our community in order to solve these in order to solve these issues.
And Kevin, I
Definitely
think
we need
oh no, go ahead. And then
sorry, I was gonna say
address.
that we definitely need to see, like, at these tables where these conversations are happening, where they're talking about our communities, because we live there. Like Kevin said, nobody knows us better than us, and even politicians should be of the community, for the community, by the community. Like there's nobody better than someone who lives there. That's someone who gets there, who is from there, who was raised there, like of the community, for the community, by the community, and that's why I run for president 2036. Vote for me.
I love that plug. I want to say that, you all are really making me think about how what I'm hearing is like this thread of relationship building amongst, like, when you're thinking about community organizations and community-based organizations and the importance of that. And when you have these larger NGOs, how are they, passing the mic, making the space to these groups and to individuals to provide that access? So kind of in this vein of thinking about community, we had a question that came in that asked us about, there are a lot of spaces that are prioritizing scalable impacts. So, for you all, what does impact or success mean? And should scalability be a priority in your work, or, maybe some of the movement, different types of movement work you all are engaged in?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. I would say that I think, like, in this world that we live in, based off numbers, data, science, like Western science, I don't measure impact by followers. I don't measure impact by the people who like the photo. I'd rather just measure the impact by those personal relationships that allow people to create change. And these are often people that I've met in my community that follow me, that I'm able to have one-on-one Zoom calls with them, just for them to tell me about their passions of what they're doing in college, or the issues that they're struggling with. Because I think at the end of the day, like, I am not going to create, I'm not going to politics in that way of like going to the US government to study to be a politician. Like, that's not my journey. But I believe that in terms of people seeking that change in storytelling for systemic change, that motivation of either grieving, anger, fury, sadness, elevates people to create their own impact. And I think that's what really makes me happy with this community, is that, like, so many low-income BIPOC students reach out to me because they don't know who to talk to about these things, or just have questions about what they're doing in their life. And it's not about doing the right thing or the wrong thing. It's just discovering yourself as a being will allow you to be more assertive in the confidence of the work that you want to do, whether that's through the system level, whether it's grassroots organizing. Like, that's what really kind of empowers me to continue staying in this movement, is knowing that like these spaces mean so much for myself and so many people. And it's not to serve corporate interests. It's not to serve these sometimes fake politicians that don't really care about us. And so I think like it's all about how we define our own way of life in that sense. So yeah.
We got another question in our Q&A from the audience that says, so we've talked about intersectionality. Part of that is also how is this movement thinking about engaging intergenerationally? So the question for you all is, have you encountered any differences between older activists and the younger wave that you all are part of? What are maybe some differences? Or I would also add, like, how has working across generations, shaped your leadership and impact in this space?
I just want to kind of return to the scalable impact question. Sorry, I was going to answer that before you asked that different question. But with the scalable impact one, I was about to say it's code red, right? I look at impact as in anything and everything that a community is doing, any change that we're bringing about. And I think it's all needed to really reverse the effects of not only climate change, but these injustices and inequalities that communities, neighborhoods, the globe is facing, right? And so I agree with what Isaiah said, all of what Isaiah said, given that it's all true. And I think with, for me specifically, I've really seen impact in multitude of ways, policy, nonprofit world, and then just individual impact as well, like what individuals can do to really help out and really cause and make a difference. And to answer your question about intergenerationalship, right? Like, how can we make sure that our movements are not only intersectional, but intergenerational, and we're working towards, getting a just world, to making sure that we're reversing the effects of climate change, and we're getting these injustices we're tackling these injustices and inequalities at their root. And I really, with intergenerationalship, I've worked with older generational activists. Like, it is something that I might have a different experience, given that I've had mentors who are older. I have had elders who are mentoring me and really teaching me the ways that they their journeys and what mistakes they've made, and making sure that I don't make the same mistakes. But yeah, I think we need more of that. I think, specifically my generation is a little bit more hesitant to work with older generations, given that, place a blame on climate change on older generations. But I think it's also key that there are a good few of them out there that are always working to fight alongside us. And if we allow them to be with us, we're able to learn their knowledge and really perfect the way that we're going to make difference and make a change. Sorry. But yeah, I'd love to hear what Isaiah and Nayeli have to say.
I think it's really important to listen to our older generation, especially in this line of work, because they were doing this way before we started. And like with me, I work hand in hand with my mom. Like, I started door to door knocking at 9 with my mom after school and after work, like seeing, and firstly in my community, seeing how active the moms were. Like, People Not also started because of the moms starting those conversations about their kids, about how we were getting sick, and about the need and the fire and the drive that change was possible, and we needed to do something about it. And I think listening to them, and I think we both need to give each other the space to listen to each other, because a lot of the times they don't. Some elder activists don't want us to participate because we're too young, and then sometimes we don't want, some youth activists don't want them to participate because they're older. And it's like, that's not the issue. Like, we're all humans. We're all people that are fighting for the same thing, protecting our earth. Like, let's just keep it as simple as that and just support each other.
Yeah, I was gonna say like on that too, like, you know, I'm much older than like Kevin Naili. Like, I'm 25, and so like it's like in certain spaces I'm seen as too young, but in certain spaces I'm seen as too old. And you know, it's valid for other spaces to have their own needs. But I would say that like in as I've gotten older, like in talking with elders, like you're not always going to agree of what they have to say. And I think that's okay. But it's also important to recognize like what they're doing, because I have been tested upon of like, well, how do you know this theory? Like, who is it from? Like, tell me like the history, because these are kind of important ways of like these people were the original folks that were part of these movement in the 1960s through the 1990s, paving the way in their communities. And so I think part of them is to also see like, you know, I love the fact that they're doing this, but let's also not forget that like we were doing this before them. And so please like make sure to reference and source us or cite us to give us credit, because a lot of the ideas, a lot of theories that I even talked about is building off of people's ideas, people's like theories of changes of these things. And so I think like there is space for critique, and there's also space for agreement and disagreement, meaning like I'm not always going to agree with someone who's older saying the way that I, you know, look, or say the way that I said something was incorrectly. And so it's all about asking ourselves like, how do we challenge our own egos? And I think intergenerational movements should always just be focused on like Black, Indigenous, Brown people and people of color at the forefront of these movements, and just taking the time to constantly collaborate. But I do think that like with social media, it has become this way where older activists do have some judgment towards younger climate activists or advocates, because they're like, well, how true are you, or how true are you to this work? And it's not to say that like these people are less than, because you know we live in a digital era today, but it is to say like, how do we leave space for both dimensions to exist that allows us to have these sustainable conversations?
Absolutely. Multiple truths can exist, right? That's totally fair. So I want to close us out and thank each and every one of you, you know, for your activism, your insight, your thoughtfulness. You all are forces to be reckoned with, and I feel so humbled to be in this space with everybody today and to be able to moderate this conversation. Before we close out, I want to ask each of you if you can share. Maybe Nayeli, we'll start with you and then go to Isaiah and then Kevin. Nayeli, if you could share where we can find you or follow you on social media or follow your work. And also if there's one or two folks that you want to uplift. We couldn't have so many people on our webinar, but if there are other folks that we want to uplift and you want to name them here, that would be great.
Yeah, you can, all of my socials are the same. So Nayeli Kobo, just my first and last name, NALLELICOB as in boy O. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all the good stuff. Think of person, I don't think I would want to uplift my community as a whole. I think my community as a whole is what started People Not Pulses. It's what motivates me day to day to fight more and more. And my mom, because she is my best friend too.
I love that. Isaiah, how about you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I put some information on there, but I want to give a shout out to two organizations. It's Black Girl Environmentalists that is ran by Wawa. They really focus on Black environmentalism to uplift Black leaders in the environmental movement. And they also run a campaign with Pass the Mic Climate. So they get celebrities, influencers, public figures to really shine and give light to their own platforms and to allow them to speak about issues that are often ignored, and knowing the fact that digital censoring does occur with a lot of Black and Brown voices. So definitely getting involved with them. And then the other organization that I would love to give a shout out is Intersectional Environmentalists. They, what you would call like it's the Generation Z environmental justice organization that really focuses on creating media hub resources for a lot of young environmentalists in college spaces and high schools. So definitely getting involved with their work is super great, and it's all based about community. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I was gonna mention intersectional environmentalists as well as Black girl environmentalists from Wawa, but two other ones I would mention. I would have to uplift Chrissy Drutman, Brown Girl Green, who's amazing. And then another one would be Generation Green. That's another amazing organization. You can both find them on Instagram at Brown Girl Green and then Generation Green. Generation_green. And then if you want to follow me or my journey, you can just search my name up on Google search, Kevin J. Patel, and all my links should be there.
Thank you so much, you all. So much gratitude for the work that you do. We're going to be watching that LA County Supervisors vote today. And yeah, just take care, take all the self-care you need. And looking forward to seeing you all online.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye, everyone.